Hi, buddies! Welcome to Emergency Pineapple Studios, where I talk about things that I love, and hopefully you do too, and today we're going to talk about Pokemon. Last time I made a video about the Kanto Pokemon who I think were improperly typed, so now I'm going to do the same thing with the Johto Pokemon that I think were also wrongly typed. Keep in mind, though, that some of this is my own opinion, as well as just things that I feel like are common sense, so without further ado, let's get started. I'm going to start this off by going through all three of the Johto starters. I understand that, keeping them single typed all the way throughout made them for a very balanced rock, paper, scissors effect, but all this has done is make it really bad for them in the long run. This makes them less viable options for competitive play, but also makes them not as good for, let's say, a Nuzlocke. So, let's give them secondary typings. For Meganium, I would have given it the fairy type when the fairy type came out. Meganium has always been more of a pleasant-looking Brontosaurus Pokemon, and honestly, I think the fairy type would suit it very well. It also happens to be very bulky and defensive, which would go really well with this typing. The Feraligatr line is actually known as the Big Jaw Pokemon and can utilize Bite and Crunch fairly well, that I think it would make for a great candidate to be a Water Dark type. Had Feraligatr been a Water Dark type when it was introduced, it would have been a great way to introduce people to the Dark type. Now, I know that Typhlosion got Hisuian Typhlosion back in Legends Arceus, but I still think original Typhlosion needs some love. And if I was going to give it a secondary typing, I would either give it Electric or I'd give it Ground. By giving it Electric, it would have been able to make good use of some of the Electric Stab that it can learn, but I know that would make it also 4 times weak to Ground. I could also see Typhlosion being a Fire Ground type, since it being based off of a Honey Badger, which loved to dig, I think would have made a very good Pokemon. On top of that, it could utilize Dig a little more effectively. I know that would make it 4 times weak to water, but we gave ground type to Torterra and it's 4 times weak to ice, and so I wouldn't see a problem with that. Next up is the regional bird Noctowl, and I know it's supposed to be a great horned owl, and with the fact that it learns so many psychic type moves, I think it should have been a psychic flying type. But I do see a problem with this. If Noctowl had been a psychic flying type, it would have overlapped with Natu and Xatu, which are almost as easily accessible in early games. In my opinion, though, I think the main issue with Noctowl is not the fact that it needs a different typing. I think it needs another evolution. But that's another video idea. Next up, we get to the first of the regional bugs, Ladian. Now, I'm not going to talk about the other one, Ariados, because I think Ariados' bug poison makes total sense. However, Ladian, where bug flying does make sense for it, I think it would have been much cooler if Ladian was a bug fighting type. Not only would this make it a little more unique, it could make more usage of a lot of the fist moves that it gets. Also, could anyone imagine just getting punched by a ladybug? That's just so funny. Kind of like with Noctowl and Xatu, I think that if Ledian had the fighting type, it would overlap too much with Heracross, who was another big promoted Pokemon in that time frame. But I still think it makes sense if Ledian was a bug fighting type and would have made for just a cool, unique experience. Plus, it could make use of Hard Fist. So, next we're going to talk about one of my favorite water type Pokemon of all time, that being Politoed. I'll be honest, when the idea of branched evolutions were introduced for some older Pokemon, I almost instantly fell in love with Politoed. For one, he's my favorite color, being green, and another is that we literally had the tadpoles actually become a frog as opposed to just staying tadpoles. However, I genuinely think my little froggy boy was done dirty. For one thing, he has a smaller base stat total than Poliwrath, which genuinely upsets me. But the other is that he only has one type. And yes, I know that Drizzle Politoed is an awesome thing to use. I do think he should be given something else. Now, originally I thought maybe giving him the Psychic or the Flying type to give him some sort of edge against Poliwrath would have been a better option. But the more I thought about it, I actually think that Politoed would have been a great candidate for Water Fairy type. And I've got a couple reasons for this. The first is the move Disarming Voice. I think that Politoed could have actually made great use of this move. And the second reason I think this is that since The Princess and the Frog is a fairy tale, and the way you evolve a Poliwhirl into a Politoed is by giving it a King's Rock. With that logic, I think that having an idea that a Pokemon based off of The Princess and the Frog would have been really cool, and so thus I think Politoed should be a water fairy type. On top of that, even with a lower base stat total in comparison to Poliwrath, it would have had some sort of edge instead in the form of the fairy typing. So, overall, Game Freak did my little froggy boy dirty, so let's give him some love. Make him a fairy type. Speaking of fairy types, now we get to Blossom, which is yet another branched evolution, where for some reason the Pokemon loses a type rather than gains a type. So the entire Oddish line is grass poison type except for Blossom, and I think it was a missed opportunity. However, I think the fact that it evolves using a Sunstone would have made a great candidate for it being a grass fire type. On top of that, it's based off of a hula dancer, which originates in Hawaii, and on top of that, one of the alternatives to hula dancing is fire dancing. So I think it would have been kind of cool if the Blossom actually was like a grass fire type. However, I also think that Grass Fairy makes just as much sense because of its happy demeanor in comparison to Vileplume. But honestly, just something in addition to it just being a basic grass type. I don't think it deserved to just be a grass type. Yanma is a dragon fly. Dragon fly. This Pokemon is a pain in the butt to catch in the Johto region, and with the amount of pain that you have to go through to find this sucker, it should have been a bug dragon type. Now, it wouldn't change how strong it is, but at the very least, you would have gotten something cool. The fact that it's just a basic bug flying is kind of upsetting, and honestly, the fact that they did not capitalize on a pun of a dragonfly makes me a little upset. Next up is Sunflora. I think this Pokemon was another missed opportunity for a grass fire type early on. Kind of like Blossom, it evolves using a Sunstone, and the fact that it is based off of the Sunflower, I think that if it was a grass fire type, it would make this useless Pokemon a little more interesting. However, as it stands, it's still just a useless grass type that you can find other places everywhere. Although I will point out that using a grass type in Johto is not a good idea. Speaking of which, I don't know if it's a mistyping, but I found Gligar's typing to be very confusing. The fact of the matter is that it has abilities like Poison Point and Poison Heal, and it can learn a lot of Poison-type moves. Not to mention, it's based on a Scorpion, so I actually assumed it would be a Poison-type Pokemon. The fact that it's ground flying is a little confusing. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not bad that it's a ground flying type, because that actually makes it more unique. I just don't think it makes a lot of sense. I think it genuinely should have been like a poison flying type. But I guess that would make it overlap with Zubat and Crobat a little too much, so I think keeping it as, just a ground flying type is fine. Again, nothing against this derpy little guy, I just think he should have been a poison type, but you know what? I don't think it's a mistyping. I think he should stay ground flying. Mischievous is another Pokemon that I think deserves a second typing, and the typing I think it deserves is Fairy. And the reason for that is that it uses magic, which the Fairy type is commonly associated with. If you need an example in modern day, the Paradox Pokemon Fluttermane, which is just a giant Mischievous, is a Ghost Fairy type. Now, I will say that being a Ghost Fairy type probably applies more to Mismagius than it does to Mischievous, but my point still stands. I still think Mischievous should have been a Fairy type. If it wasn't clear in the last video, this little duck should not be a normal type. I go more into detail about Porygon being an electric psychic type, or the fact that it should be an electric psychic type, in my last video. Porygon 2 is no exception. Like I said in the last time, it should be an electric psychic type. It's a program. Nothing is normal about this stupid little duck. Electric psychic type. Nothing else needs to be said. It is not normal. It is a digital duck. Go away. I'm now going to jump all the way to both of the box art legendaries, Ho-Oh and Lugia, but I'm going to talk about one more than the other. Let's start with Ho-Oh. I know that Ho-Oh is supposed to be this magical phoenix that has, revival powers. However, I think the fact that it is fire flying is kind of odd, and honestly makes it overlap too much with Moltres that had come out beforehand. Now, fire flying makes total sense because, like I said, it's supposed to be like a rainbow phoenix, But I think it would have been more interesting if instead of being fire flying, it was like, fire fairy and had like levitate. So it didn't take damage from ground type moves as well. That or making it like, psychic flying, kind of like Lugia, and just go lean into a different part of psychic. However, fire flying still makes sense. Lugia, okay, let me be very clear about this. I love Lugia. It is my favorite legendary Pokemon, but oh my god, why is this thing's typing so bad? Well, bad is probably the wrong word for this. It doesn't make sense. It is the guardian beast of the sea. It lives in the water, learns a lot of water type moves. Honestly, water flying. But it's psychic flying. To be honest, I don't care which of the two types you drop, whether it's the psychic or the flying, because it does have psychic powers. But it needs to be a water type as well. Like, it just doesn't make sense. So, here's my proposition. Make it water psychic, water flying, or if you want to keep it with psychic flying as its typing, give it an ability that gets it like defensive or offensive bonuses for using water type moves. Because honestly, that would make a lot more sense. I love you, Lugia, but your typing doesn't make sense, buddy. It really doesn't. I'm sorry. And the last Pokemon that I think is mistyped is Celebi. Okay, let me explain this one, because this one is... it makes sense for what typing it is, but at the same time, I really think that we need to rethink it. When Celebi came out, the fairy type didn't exist, and quite literally this guardian of the forest, magical user of time, is quite literally a sylph fairy. For those of you who don't know, sylphs are magical fairies in Celtic mythology that usually are guardians of some sort of forest of somewhere or another. Now, on top of that, when it was first introduced, it was a psychic grass type. By the way, makes total sense. Guardian of the forest, time-traveling Pokemon, psychic type makes total sense for it. Grass type also makes sense. It controls a forest. But it's a fairy. It's like quite literally a fairy. So when the fairy type came out and they decided not to change Celebi's typing, I thought it was kind of confusing. Now, again, grass and psychic make total sense. However, I actually think that if we dropped the grass typing and gave it the psychic fairy typing, would also make just as much sense. Or making it a grass fairy would make just as much sense. But kind of like with Lugia, I think if we gave it an ability that gave it stab for the fairy type, kind of like what happened with Delmise, I think it would make Celebi significantly cooler and honestly would make more sense. But unlike Lugia, the typing that Celebi got made sense at the time. We just now live in a time where the fairy type exists, and thus, I think Celebi, as a genuine fairy, should be a fairy type. And those are all the Pokemon in Johto who I think have incorrect typings. If you agree or disagree with my assessments, or if you have some other Pokemon who you think in Johto need to be retyped, leave some in the comments below. Like and subscribe, because the next one I'm doing is Hoenn, and I hope to see you again. Go have fun catching more Pokemon. See you next time.